I'm Curtis Knight, Executive Director at California Trout and your host of the Fishwater People podcast. On this episode, we're talking floodplains, fish food, international conservation initiatives, environmental equity, and resource management in California. And we had the opportunity to chat with the person who leads it all, California's Secretary for Natural Resources, Wade Crowfoot. This interview was a great opportunity to ask Wade what was on the top of his mind. Obviously, water and climate change issues are at the forefront, outdoor access for all, and plenty of issues that we here at CalTrout are passionate about ourselves. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to the natural resources of our beautiful state. It's a big job. The Natural Resources Agency houses the Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources, the Department of Water Resources, the California Energy Commission, and more. So let's get into it and hear about it all from Wade himself.
We are responsible for caring for the state's environment, what we consider our natural resources, our cultural and historic resources. There's a lot of great things about this job, one of which is I get to advise Governor Newsom on environmental policy and as a member of his cabinet. So lots of things that we're working on across our agency and the administration.
That's an amazing job, Wade. And well, welcome to the Fishwater People podcast. And it's an exciting job too. I mean, like you're saying, you're kind of in that sort of inner circle with the governor, and the breadth of what the agency covers always staggers me. You have Department of Fish and Wildlife, Department of Water Resources, CAL FIRE, Department of Conservation. You have some energy in there, Department of Parks and Rec, the California Conservation Corps, 10 state conservancies. I mean, that's not even all of it.
Yeah. All told, there are 26 different entities from our largest department, which is CAL FIRE, that surges up to over 10,000 firefighters during the height of fire season, to some of our state conservancies, which have just a handful of people, about 25,000 people in total, and just a vast set of responsibilities. To your point, everything from ocean and coastal protection to forests, wildfire, and landscapes, to water, energy, biodiversity, and fish and wildlife. It really is just a broad and sometimes daunting set of responsibilities.
I can imagine there. And I can imagine too, as you know, if you're sort of the voice of this for the governor on all these issues. And I mean, at any given day, this has got to be top of mind for the governor on so many of these things, whether it's summertime and wildfire season or what's going on with water is always a hot topic. So it must be like a daily pressure tank right there.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, especially where we find ourselves given accelerating climate change. You know, to be governor of California is a Herculean task. So we're the fourth largest economy in the world. And boy, natural resources management is central to so much of what we're doing these days.
Yeah, and what a turn, we've had from the last couple years, and now this crazy water year that we're having so far. And it's like those predictions that all the scientists have said, the dry is going to be drier, the wet's going to be wetter, where it seems like we're living in it. So I know climate change is a priority of the governor. I know it's top of your mind too. I mean, how do you guys think about climate change and what's going on right now?
Well, I think historically, we considered California to be a leader on combating climate change. So think back to, 10 or 20 years ago, where California was the first government in the world really to pass a law to reduce carbon pollution. And we've had great success, essentially shifting the trajectory downward on carbon pollution, which is great. I think back then we used to think about climate adaptation as sort of a wonky planning exercise for future decades. And, what we've realized is actually adapting to climate change is a matter of urgent public safety and really urgent environmental action. So much of what I do in this job is protecting people and nature from the impacts of climate change and helping us adjust and helping nature and people continue to thrive amidst climate change. We, of course, have this Mediterranean climate in California, like the European Mediterranean, like parts of Australia and Chile and South Africa. We're all experiencing similar impacts, which, to your point, the dry periods are getting drier and more pernicious. The wet periods are getting more intense, and we're working to adjust in real time. What do we have to do to continue to lead the world, reducing pollution, transitioning energy and transportation away from fossil fuels, while we're continuing to adjust to these impacts?
Yeah, we're right in the thick of it. It's amazing how, I mean, all those issues you brought up too are big issues anyway. 20 years ago, they were big issues, and now it's all accelerated. How do you think about something that, some of these issues are huge, they're daunting. I mean, how do you think about making progress on something like, say, wildfire, forestry? How do we get a handle on something like that? Everybody sees the problem. Everybody sees these thickets out there, the dense forests, the dying trees. But how do you begin to take steps to cover so much ground and make these types of improvements?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think first of all, we're in the middle of a pretty significant paradigm shift as it relates to environmental management, and wildfire is a really good example. We have over 100 years of governmental policy that was trying to suppress all fire, even as our population was moving into more rural areas that were subject to fire. And what we obviously know now is wildfire is part of our environmental cycle, and it's not about suppressing it, but it is about managing it. So we are, sort of going back to the future, learning from indigenous cultural practices, working towards many more prescribed fires across the state, more action to manage the situation up front and not only respond to wildfires when they happen. But likewise, on water policy, similar paradigm shift. We know that we can implement nature-based solutions to address flood threats. So seasonal floodplains are, that nature-based solution to flooding. So we're working to shift our paradigm from a real reliance on gray infrastructure in the water sector to more reliance on nature-based infrastructure. The challenge is, of course, climate change is on the march. And so what we're working to do is shift the paradigm and make some pretty significant investments quick enough to actually continue to protect people and nature. But I am really, really energized by the fact that we're really looking at the situation differently than we have traditionally.
Yeah, totally. And you see it out there. You see it out there with state and federal funding. It's certainly a big part of what CalTrout's focused on. And you start to see, when you really look at those, you start to see just the numerous multiple benefits that you get.
Yeah. And I mean, what you're getting at is just how holistic our natural environment is, and how we have to recognize that when we do one thing, it has an impact on many other things. And I think that's a challenge for government. We have big complex organizations organize themselves around division of labor, and in government's no different. So we have these departments, these agencies, these boards, these commissions that have all done different things for a long time.
Right.
And every year, we pass over 1,000 new laws in California. And so over time, we have, a set of legal requirements, regulatory approaches in each of these different entities. And the challenge is when we step back and we recognize the need to move quickly and holistically, sometimes all of that process, all of that governmental structure gets in the way. So not only, we're kind of engaged in this intellectual paradigm shift, but then now we're working to modify, to reform our institutions, our processes effectively enough to actually manifest that paradigm shift.
Yeah. The mechanics of it. How do you actually get it done? Well, that's fascinating too, because you think, so how do you break down maybe some of the silos and get more of that, crosswise thinking going department to department?
Yeah, well, I would first of all say that, while we're a big agency, we still have to work outside of our agency. So when it comes to state water policy, we work with our sister agency, Cal EPA, and the state's water board. But we also have a lot of interaction with the federal agencies, whether it's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA Fisheries or the Bureau of Reclamation. But Curtis, you make a good point, which is people in leadership roles like mine have to recognize this and get people and institutions to work together toward a common goal. And that's why I'm really excited with our progress on the so-called cutting the green tape initiative.
Yeah.
So early on in Governor Newsom's administration, he made it really clear that we have to get out of our own way to get good things done more quickly. And no better case than environmental restoration. So I learned as I looked into the topic that it's sometimes a third of a restoration project's budget is taken up with planning and permitting. So the very same environmental laws that we put in place to avoid negative environmental impacts are slowing down and making more expensive these restoration projects that we desperately need, which, again, unintended consequences. So early on, we established cutting the green tape, and it's all about bringing our agencies together, but also practitioners, whether they're conservation organizations like yours at CalTrout, local governments, resource conservation districts, tribal governments, and to really understand how can we shift the way that we permit these projects, that we approve these projects, that we fund these projects to allow more of these projects to happen more quickly. And I'm proud of our progress, but we have a lot of work ahead of us.
Yeah, totally. It's awesome. I mean, we've benefited directly from that cutting the green tape, and you can see the opportunity. And it is sometimes maddening where you get funded by the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and then you got to turn around and get a permit from the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And it really speaks to that issue of speed and scale. And that's certainly, I think, one of the ways to do that. You know, how do you make it more efficient to put the public investment back onto the ground to do good?
Yeah, and I would say, there's a little bit of a trade-off, right? Which is if we move, more quickly, some people will be concerned about, have we checked every last box? Are we creating a risk and unintended consequences? But the challenge is, we have climate impacts that are moving, quite fast. And in fisheries, for example, we have fish species, wildlife species too, that are imperiled. So from my perspective, moving slowly is a decision in its own right. And it's a decision I don't think we can make. We have to move more quickly. Yeah. So I think what we're focused on is how do we ensure that, the state agencies, the government is playing the role it intends to play, ensuring that funds are well spent and trying to minimize unintended consequences. But at the same time saying like, look, we're going to make some mistakes along the way. We're going to learn from our lessons, but we have to move. We have to get these projects in place. That's very much of my philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you brought up an interesting dynamic there too with, I think, wildfire and drought are probably the two of the best examples of something like that, where you have to balance the public safety aspect of things. You see all this, so like, we need to spread floodwaters out, let them sink in, recharge our groundwater. We need to do controlled burning. Doesn't always stay controlled. We've seen that throughout the West, but I think we're going to get better at that. But how do you, it's that speed and scale you want to go, but I think you're pointing out too that you also have to balance this idea of public safety and sort of march that way.
Yeah, it's a tremendous balancing act, right? I fundamentally think that people and nature can thrive together, and that's really what our goal is in California, to show the world how we do that. At the same time, it does create challenges. When we have the driest 3-year period in the state's history, there is a challenge between, water for people, for communities, for agriculture, and then water that stays in rivers for water quality and fish and wildlife. And, we get criticized often from folks on the polarized, ends of that conversation.
Right.
There are those that, live in communities that rely on agriculture, and they feel like the state is, starving their communities of economic opportunities because of our water policies. And likewise, we have colleagues in the environmental movement that, feel like we're, threatening or worsening extinction threats as a result of our policies. And so, we're doing our best to balance, and amidst, unprecedented conditions that we never experienced. Yeah, I do think we can do both. We can ensure that there's more water flowing through rivers, that we're restoring habitat, and that we're building, water security for communities. I think it's untenable for a leader of a state like California to sacrifice any of those commitments. That's what we're really working toward.
Let's talk a little bit about flood too, just that flood aspect of it. You've been a big supporter of some of the work that CalTrout and a bunch of others have done in the Central Valley on flood management, sort of the science behind it. When you were with Governor Brown, with the Water Foundation, current role, been a big supporter of this. But this idea of how do we start to reclaim, just thinking about the Sacramento Valley, let's just narrow the geography a little bit, but how do you start to reclaim some of the floodplain function and some of that when you have federal levies and managed systems and existing land uses like that. Seems like there's opportunity there, but the challenges of actually implementing floodplain reform and restoration is a really hard thing to do.
Yeah, but I will say, on a positive note, I think we've reached sort of an inflection point on this question around, restoration of floodplains. And I think that we've had this collective aha moment that we can protect against flood risk, protect communities vulnerable to flood really effectively through this multi-benefit floodplain restoration. So it protects against flood risk, provides some great habitat for salmon and fish and wildlife, and it allows groundwater basins to recharge in a lot of areas. It's a win-win-win. And so you have environmental conservation groups, shoulder to shoulder with farmers, with groundwater management agencies, all pushing these projects. And when I say we've reached an inflection point, it is now state policy within the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan to prioritize multi-benefit projects. And that was some result of, the advocacy of your organizations and others. It used to be that, floodplains were considered, it's kind of a nice to have, but sort of a marginal strategy. And now they're really a central strategy. Just outside of Sacramento, we have an incredible system of floodplains, including our YOLO bypass. So if you drive your car to and from the Bay Area, you go over that causeway. Well, that YOLO bypass was working full-time during the January atmospheric rivers, protecting Sacramento, that's one of the most flood-prone communities in the country, but then also providing all of that habitat. So to me, it's not a question of, experimenting on a new approach. It's about really institutionalizing our priority for this. I will say that, we've got real good partners at the Army Corps of Engineers. I think traditionally the Corps could be criticized for more of a gray infrastructure traditional approach, but, they've got a big national effort called Engineering with Nature. And so, that's a big battleship to turn around in terms of their processes and legal requirements. But I do think everyone's rowing in the same direction, to use an apt metaphor.
Very apt, yeah. Totally. I think those bypasses are maybe widely underappreciated, especially with the general public, about what they are. I mean, we could have a system that's big old tall levees, but we don't have that. We have these outlet valves, these relief valves that, as you're mentioning, have hundreds of thousands of acres of potential habitat. And I'm encouraged by what we've been working on with you all and a bunch of others on how do you create some of those flood conditions that you have in the YOLO bypass in a year like this. How do you create them, if not every year, most years? Whether it's a wet year, normal year, dry year, whatever. How do you start to function them every year so that they do get the benefits for waterfowl, groundwater recharge, fish, and still be a multi-use area?
Yeah, and I'm so optimistic about this approach because there are so many projects that are queued up. Mm-hmm. It's a question of money. It's a question of cutting the green tape. But there is a lot of interest, and not only in the Sacramento Valley, which is a great place for this, but also in the San Joaquin Valley, where you have some watersheds that are really flood prone, but hasn't been a major focus of floodplain restoration. So I'd like to see, over the next 4 years in the second term of Governor Newsom, us to be able to initiate and ultimately complete, more floodplain projects in more parts of the state.
All right. Well, let's go. We actually have a CalTrout region that's an amazing example of just that, the Central Valley, where we're working to leverage floodplain science and influence policy to promote robust fisheries. Let's pull in one of our CalTrout team members to tell us more.
Thanks, Curtis. I'm Jacob Katz. I'm lead scientist at CalTrout, and the only worthwhile job I ever held.
It's not the only job you've ever held.
Well, just about. I misspent my youth fishing otherwise. So unless you count all the various guiding jobs and bug counting, but no, this was great. I've been with you guys since you and Jeff Thompson hired me out of grad school. So it's home. CalTrout's home.
No, I love working with you and the energy you bring. And really, when you started with CalTrout, I think it was around 2012, you sort of brought with it sort of an expanded footprint for us to work. We hadn't worked a whole lot in the Central Valley, but you really focused on this importance of floodplains, especially in the valley. A lot of your focus is in the Sacramento system, but talk about, just from a basic level, why are floodplains so important?
Well, floodplains are one of the critical links in that chain of habitat that every fish population needs. Every life stage of a salmonid relies on very distinct parts of the watershed. And if it's a salmon, the floodplains are the place where those juvenile fish find the resources they need, find the food they need to get big, to get strong, and to ensure that they come back as healthy, large adults to produce the next generation of juveniles. So that piece about floodplains, it's not that they're really any more important than any other link in that chain, but it takes every link in the chain, and it just so happens that the floodplains have been largely misunderstood and are missing from the way that rivers are managed in the Central Valley.
I mean, of course, there's levees there, and I think everybody understands how levees fit into a flood control system, but they also cut off access of the river to these floodplains. Where are the opportunities to kind of expand out and introduce the river back to floodplains in the Sacramento Valley?
Because there's so many levees, the answer to that is just about everywhere. But there's some real key places, right? I mean, the whole Central Valley was this mosaic of different kinds of wetlands. The river interacted with these broad, shallow wetland basins in a way that created a mosaic of different kinds of wetland habitat values. And the key thing about wetlands is they're productive. Incredible amounts of food. And what's food? Solar energy turned into sugar by plants, right? But that happens out there on those fertile wetlands that stretch off in both directions from river channels. And when you get in there, drain the water off those floodplains in order to plant crops or to build cities, and at the same time build levees, just pile up dirt that separates the river channel from the landscape, well, then you fundamentally alter the way the water flows across the landscape. And in so doing, there's some really important consequences, especially for fish. In this case, the food's on the floodplain and you've cut it off. So what are we trying to do in the valley? We're trying to get either the fish back out to the food on the floodplains, or manage floodplains that are on the other side of levees in such a way where you can make that food and drain it back to the fish that are stuck in levied river channels that are essentially food desert.
Yeah, so let's talk about those two strategies a little bit because they're so fascinating. So the first one, in places where you can get fish onto these floodplain habitats that are often now rice fields or other type of ag use, there are opportunities to get fish onto there during the wintertime when these fields are fallow and grow juvenile fish, right?
Yeah, no, that's just it. And again, what we're trying to do here is just recognize that you can never go back. Here we are in the middle of the Sacramento Valley. This is one of the most intensively farmed and lucrative agricultural landscapes on Earth. And that many of those places where the river can still spread out, where it still does have access either over or through some kind of levee or berm to get out and spread out and slow down on the floodplain, those are agricultural. And it just so happens that we're blessed in the Sac Valley with these floodways called bypasses. They're basically high pressure floodwater release valves. The Sacramento gets so much water in such a short time under these storms that we now call atmospheric rivers or the Pineapple Express, rain on snow events. But in these times when it was recognized that you couldn't keep all those floodwaters between two high levees in the Sacramento River, as had happened in most of the other rivers in the United States, or really in the developed north of the globe, most rivers are really completely cut off from the landscape. But in the Sac Valley, because you got so much water, you had to have these places that gave the water room to bypass around important places like Sacramento. And so we have these bypasses that are 60,000 acres in the case of Yolo Bypass. It is a landscape that is still out there where the river and fish in those river waters can get out onto the floodplain. And so we've really focused on those places as what we call getting the fish to the food, imagining and reconfiguring the way that the levees work so that instead of only allowing floodwaters out, in maybe 2 out of 10 years under really large flood conditions, we put gates in those levees to allow fish and water out 2, 3, 4 times a year, even in normal and dry years. And what that means is that those fish have access consistently every year to the incredible pantry that is the floodplain.
I don't know that a lot of people really understand these bypasses really well. It's really hard if you don't have the right map, and it's hard to conceptualize them. But I think a lot of people have driven over the bypass, maybe without knowing it, on 80 and I-5 as you sort of square into that area just north or just a little bit west of the airport, Sacramento Airport. That's basically the bypass. These places, you touched on this. I mean, they're effective as flood control structures right now. They take huge amounts of flood water and shunt them away from the airport, away from our capital, and go out into this massive area, the YOLO bypass, 60,000 acres. What an opportunity, as you're getting at here, to, yes, use it as a public safety feature for sure, but also maximize its real potential for really what it is, recreating habitat and natural process in there. It's a huge opportunity that seems to be sitting there to be had.
Yeah, it's a huge engine of natural production that is sitting idle right now, and that we've been squandering that incredible productivity that happens when we slow floodwaters, when we spread them out across the landscape, and they not only sink into recharge aquifers, but they also facilitate this incredible production of life. And that's because all of that sugar that's stored out there as plant matter on the floodplain, right? That's where we grow our crops. And it's where a river system also creates the energy that it needs to make fish. But it takes a little bit of time. It takes puddling that water up for several weeks to allow that carbon, that energy source, to move up through that aquatic food web to turn into bugs. And then those bugs turn into healthy, fat little fish. We call them floodplain fatties.
So you produce this fish food in these fields. And I think this year we're up to like 60, 70,000 acres will be rotated through and dumped. That water will be dumped into the river. And you all have documented. I remember one year we had cages at different mile marks downstream from where this fish food was going into the main stem sac, and you were seeing positive growth response for miles downstream.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. What we've wanted to do is just as rigorously as possible document all of this stuff scientifically through data. And so as we've studied wetland habitats across the Sacramento Valley and saw that everywhere that you spread water out in a puddle for at least 3 weeks, and it didn't matter if it was a rice field or the low side of a winter wheat field or weeds in a fallow field or natural riparian jungle along rivers. In every one of those places, after a minimum of about 21 days, you'd see this flourishing aquatic food web. Zoop soup, we call it, for zooplankton soup. And so what we've been able to do is document that food grows up in these fields, that it can move from the field to the canal, that it can move from the canal to the river, and that the fish that get access to that food, that floodplain derived food web resource in the river, even though they can't get out onto the floodplain, they're still growing almost as fast as the floodplain fatties there on the other side of the levee. And then we wanted to look at not just what happens right there where that muddy, fertile soup hits the river, but let's compare that to what's happening upstream where the fish don't have access to that floodplain food. And then let's look at it every mile downstream as far as we can go. And so far, what we've seen is that the fish at the junction of the floodplain and the river are growing 8 times faster than those fish upstream. But fish that are a full 6 miles downstream of that subsidy source are still growing 4 times as fast as those upstream fish. So what we're seeing is no single place is going to suddenly restore the river ecosystem, but that bringing the food into that food-starved river channel is really important, and the fish have the capacity to really benefit from.
Yeah, that's incredible. I love the innovation. I love the science-based approach to that whole thing. Document the data, prove the concept. We call it, a wild fish into altered landscapes. We got to figure out a way to do that in California, especially. So let's bring this home a little bit. You're trying to get juvenile salmon, steelhead, out-migrating fish, also as a native fish, fatter and healthier as they're heading out to the ocean. Why is that so important, one? And then talk about some of the work that our colleagues at UC Davis have done with fish eye lenses.
Just the preponderance of evidence globally shows that a fish that is larger when it hits the salt, when it hits the marine, all other things equal, is more likely to return as adult. But finally, through research done by our colleagues at UC Davis Center for Watershed Sciences and at the National Marine Fisheries Service Southwest Fisheries Science Center, have shown that a fish that gets access to floodplain-derived food benefits and returns. And that's done by looking at isotopes of sulfur that are found at different proportions on floodplain and in a wetland than they are in the river. You know that mucky smell, that rotten egg smell that you get when your foot sinks down into the oozing mud of a wetland? Well, that's often a sulfur compound. And it's exactly those sulfur compounds which are incorporated into the flesh of the invertebrates that the fish eat. And then on the premise that you are what you eat, those same sulfur compounds are actually recorded in the eye lens of these fish. And those eye lenses are basically like small onions, where each layer records a different time in the life cycle of that fish. So what that means is that you have a diet journal for every fish. If you look deep into its eyes, it'll tell you its life history. Those are archival tissues. And so now, by popping out the eyes of an adult salmon that has successfully made it back and has spawned in the upper watershed, we can look and see if it, on its way out as a juvenile, got floodplain food or didn't. And what we know is that although there's very little chance for those, especially winter run, the most endangered of the Chinook salmon in the Sacramento Valley, to actually access floodplains and floodplains food, the vast majority, like over 90% in most years, of the returning adults have that signature of floodplain-derived food web resources. We have the smoking gun.
Yeah, even though such a small percentage actually got access to the floodplains, they're overwhelmingly the ones that are coming back. It's interesting how you could take this managed approach to create a natural process.
That's exactly, that is it. In its entirety, that's it, which is to say that we can't ever go back, but we have to look back in order to move forward. We have to understand that pre-development, we had a working, functional landscape, a riverscape, that there are these patterns of interaction between water and the landscape through which it flows that our native fish, our native critters, our native plants are adapted to. They have honed evolutionary keys that fit into the landscape's lock. And by altering those patterns with dams, with levees, with changing the way that sediment flows through the system, etc., then what we do is change the tumblers on that lock. And now this native species, it doesn't recognize the river that it evolved in. It doesn't have a key that fits the lock. And what we can do with this approach that CalTrout's taking on, this process-based reconciliation, is to say, hey, as a management objective, what we have a chance to do is to understand that while we can't go back, we can approximate some of those patterns. And in so doing, we can allow a native fish's evolutionary key to once again fit the lock of landscape.
You're listening to the Fishwater People podcast by California Trout, a nonprofit organization founded in 1971 to ensure healthy waters and resilient wild fish for a better California. Our goal is to restore vibrance and abundance to California's freshwater ecosystems and to keep them that way for years to come. To find out more about the work CalTrout is doing across the state or to become a member, visit caltrout.org. That's CalTrout.org. We're back with Secretary Crowfoot. Now, let's shift gears a little bit and zoom out to even larger restoration goals. I'd like to talk about the 30 by 30 initiative. First, kind of define what that is. I know it's kind of an international movement. What was your role in developing that? What's going on there?
Well, a few years ago, Chuck Bonham, who leads our Fish and Wildlife Department, and I went to Berkeley, and we heard E.O. Wilson, who's, of course, the famous naturalist, talk. And E.O. Wilson, who was, it turns out, coming to the end of his life, was really pressing for a half-Earth approach. Let's protect half of the Earth for environmental benefit. And so that morphed into an international movement to protect a third of our planet by 2030. And a remarkable number of countries started to express interest in doing that. In other words, stepping up to protect 30% of their lands and waters in the next decade. So we got wind of that and got really excited about that, both Governor Newsom and some of our legislators. And Chuck and I actually took the governor's family fishing up in the Sierra Nevada and had an opportunity to talk to he and the first partner, Jen Seibel Newsom. So fast forward, the governor stepped up and embraced and called for and directed this 30 by 30 target for California. And that is durably protect, primarily for environmental benefit, 30% of our lands and coastal waters by 2030. So we're a state of about 104 million acres. And if you do the assessment analysis around what percentage of our lands are protected already, whether it's national parks or wilderness areas, state parks, ecological preserves, almost 23%, 24% of our lands are protected. So in order to achieve that 30 by 30 goal, we're going to need to improve conservation, durable, meaningful, effective conservation on about 7 million acres of land. As it relates to our coastal waters, when you do that same analysis, it suggests that about 16% of our coastal waters, which run from the beach to 3 miles off our coast, are protected. So we have a big challenge and opportunity there as well. So the governor put out his executive order, charged our agency with establishing a roadmap. And now, fast forward, we've got a strategy called Pathways to 30 by 30. 30 by 30 has sort of 3 North Stars: biodiversity, climate benefit, in other words, maximizing our ability of lands and waters to sequester carbon, to remove and store carbon, buffer our communities from impacts, but then also expanding access to the outdoors. We want to break away from this traditional thought that somehow we're protecting nature from people. Our tribal partners tell us people are at the center of nature protection.
Yeah, I think that third one's really interesting. That idea of equity as it relates to this natural infrastructure investment maybe is one way to look at it, because we think a lot of times, especially in our world as CalTrout, it's like, oh, you can see that narrow lens sometimes that you're protecting these areas that a lot of people are never going to see because they're off in the woods. And I love where you're going there, where you switch the narrative a little bit to say, this investment in natural infrastructure is going to benefit every Californian.
Yeah, I mean, we've been on a journey in the Newsom administration, certainly since, 2020 with the murder of George Floyd, and this real reckoning around, how do we build a California for all? Let's recognize that we're one of the most affluent places in the world, or one of the largest economies, but we have, a significant share of Californians that can't access the opportunities and the prosperity that many of us enjoy. And that extends to natural resources in the outdoors. The fact is, a lot of Californians don't have a place where they can recreate, safely outdoors. A lot of Californians don't feel welcome in the places that do offer these opportunities because of a lack of a welcoming approach, or the interpretation of a history that they don't view as their own, or the staff in our open spaces not reflecting the diversity of California. So when we recognize that, we recognize that central to what we're doing in terms of stewarding the environment is stewarding the environment better for everyone, right? And we recognize that the environmental movement, I mean, let's be honest, a lot of our environmental organizations, that hasn't been a priority historically. Mm-hmm. And that, it could be criticized as an elitist pursuit or priority. Mm-hmm. And that's got to change. One, because it's the right thing to do, but it's also the smart thing to do. I mean, the fact is our country is getting more and more diverse, and our traditional environmental movement has been, largely white and is aging. And if we expect Americans to continue to defend and lift up and protect and call for more national parks and nature protection, we have to make sure that all Americans can connect with nature and understand, how important this is. So I'm really, really energized by this. I think this is going to be one of our legacies if we get it right, to really shift our focus from simply, protecting nature for its own benefit or for the benefit of those who already use it, to really ensure that what we're doing to protect nature works and benefits everyone.
Yeah, it's so well said. And we talk a lot internally about how we don't achieve our mission unless we do that.
Absolutely. I mean, we need to bring our organizations out of their comfort zone, simply put. We need to challenge ourselves and recognize, well, I'll speak for myself. I recognize that, I inherited an institution, I lead an institution, that's perpetuated a lot of the disconnection and inequity that we're now trying to redress. I hope to host a forum where we heard from Black conservation leaders, one of whom was the former state parks director. And he explained that our agency, the Natural Resources Agency, needed to be forced under court order to desegregate its hiring. Right? So when you think about the legacy of that, we shouldn't be surprised that our employees, while they're incredible, do not reflect the diversity of California. So how do we recognize that and challenge ourselves not only to pay this lip service as a priority, but to actually use the time we have leading these organizations to actually change them?
When you think about the 30 by 30 aspect of this, there's a real voluntary collaborative focus of it. It's not you're going to do it all. It's that you're going to pull everybody together and try to meet these goals.
Absolutely. I mean, we talk about 30 by 30. If we're going to succeed, it's a movement. It's definitely not a government program. It's not even an initiative. It's a movement. And we need, everyone pulling in the same direction. And, we'll achieve 30 by 30 by local actions, whether it's, led by tribal governments or local governments or, groups like CalTrout or, resource conservation districts. It's the sum total of all of these localized focus efforts that are going to achieve 30 by 30. And part of this, a central part of this, is learning from tribes and recognizing with humility that our state government came in, and while we did a lot of great things, we interrupted that leadership. We disconnected tribes from their lands. We discriminated against them exercising their practices. We perpetuated violence, and we have to redress that. And what does that look like? It looks like working with tribes. We have over 100 federally recognized tribes. So working with tribes as government to government partnerships to co-manage our resources, try to formalize relationships where we're sharing responsibility for resources, identifying ways that we can take public lands and return them to indigenous ownership and stewardship, identifying ways that we can have actually tribes proactively manage our resources. There's a lot of good examples that, just the tip of the iceberg, we hope, in terms of really centering tribes at this work. And I think, we're foolish not to follow tribal leadership, given just the incredible legacy, that's spanned over literally thousands of years among tribes.
It's amazing that it's taken this long. And can we just shift a little bit to maybe the politics of this a little bit? Because you're a political appointee. You're working really closely with the governor. There's stuff flying around every day that are challenging the balances that are happening out there. And I know in a year like this, water management and how it's managed is a big one. Politics work their way into these issues probably on a daily basis.
I mean, yeah, of course, any public policy issue like this, has this kind of political overlay. But, I want to be clear that I think there sometimes can be this external perception that it's like the politics of this group or that group that are driving management. And I've got to say, realistically, what we're working to do is trying to essentially balance needs of everyone, the environment and people. And that's what's really driving this. we're going to do our best to manage environmental conditions in such an uncertain environment. But I think we all have to train our focus down the road, which is like, what are we going to do to create durable improvements in our environmental, conditions in our rivers? And while we manage, for this winter and the ongoing drought that's modifying, daily, we're gonna stay focused on that long-term approach. We're trying to avoid this short-term thinking where people say, "Oh my gosh, we're in drought, so we have to scurry around and do a bunch of things, and then we're quote unquote back to normal, and we can forget about this for a while." Right. I think that's very much the traditional approach, but the way I put it is we are in a new normal, and that new normal is going to be ultimately hotter and drier. So we have to be smarter with the way that we use water. We have to manage our water more carefully. We just aren't going to have the, sort of the flexibility that we've had in the past, or the give in the system that we've had in the past.
Nothing like a couple of crazy water years to really help drive this home to, I think, all Californians. Maybe we could start to close here, Wade. Man, that was fascinating how you mentioned, love to hear that the governor's thinking about how does nature fit into this equation of climate change. And you see some of that out there where, we got to electrify the grid and decarbonize the grid and electrify transportation and the food systems and, recapturing carbon where we can. But you're starting to see that more and more, that nature, biodiversity is an essential role in there. Like if you don't have that, everything starts to unravel and you're not going to meet your goals.
Yeah, I think that there's a global recognition of the role of nature in combating the climate crisis. And, to some of your listeners who may, think about that, and have thought about that for a very long time, that could seem a little obvious, but there has been so much focus across the world, but even in California on, technology solutions to climate change, more renewable energy, zero emission vehicles, energy efficiency. That stuff is all good, but we need functioning natural systems. And we need the world and the earth to do what it can, which is, regulate our carbon cycle. And so 30 by 30, I think, was driven by a recognition that we need to help nature help us, simply put. Now we have a tremendous opportunity amidst a really existential threat, which is how are we going to protect and restore the amount of nature that we need to?
It's going to take all of us working together to get on the right track. We all need to stay informed and do everything we can to help restore and protect the resources we rely on. And here at California Trout, we know it's no small task we have ahead of us. In fact, it's huge and it can be daunting. So to bring a little wisdom to the situation, let's hear from CalTrout's ambassador and archivist, Greg Ballinger.
Looking into our lofty goals with the Clean Water Act and the 30 by 30 measure, it's hard for me to envision, on one hand, that goal being achieved. On the other hand, if we don't have goals, nothing will be achieved. It reminds me about the saying attributed to Yogi Berra that says, it's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. And regarding wilderness and rivers, don't forget that what's been voted in can likewise be voted out. And 100% it depends on who you vote into office. We saw during the past administration that he immediately went against national monuments, particularly the one I'm thinking of right now is Bears Ears in Utah. It's easy to get bogged down in the idea that my voice doesn't matter or your voice doesn't matter. But in fact, collectively, it's imperative that we use our voices. If we don't use them, who else will? And we're so cynical about the law and who is in charge and what administration is in power at the time and what their goals are. We do ourselves, and in fact, anyone in the future, a disservice by standing back and wringing our hands and saying, oh, it's just too much. We have to be involved. It's imperative that we're involved. And if not now, when? There is no future to look into idyllically and say, oh, maybe 10 years from now we'll address that. It's easy to hope that someone else will take the initiative, But in fact, collectively, it's the nature of our system that we all be involved and don't expect someone else to do it. We all need to be aware, very, very aware, that the future is in our hands.
Thanks so much to Secretary Wade Crowfoot, Jacob Katz, and Craig Ballinger for making this episode possible. And as always, thanks to Wilco for the theme song and their support for the fish. I'm Curtis Knight, Executive Director of CalTrout and your host of the Fishwater People podcast. This episode was written, produced, and engineered by Bridget Shaw and Drew Alvarez of Pusher Media along the banks of the Upper Sacramento River in Dunsmuir, California. And that is a wrap on season 1 of the Fishwater People podcast. We're already gearing up for our next season with more great guests, so be sure to keep an eye out for new episodes in the coming weeks and months. Thanks to everyone who helped make season 1 possible.